Hello, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. One question I'm often asked, including by such esteemed individuals as my YouTube neighbor Matthew Colville, is how is it different to think in a different language, specifically a different language that I know well, such as Old Norse. I think sometimes people expect there to be more to thought in a different language than there is, or they think that there will be differences in places where there really aren't. For the most part, you don't have phenomena where you just can't say something in one language that you can say in another. I think the major differences between one language and another in terms of thought are basically taxonomic differences. What words fall into what categories? How are certain things categorized? Not so much how they're perceived, but just what falls into what. So colors are, of course, an excellent example. I've talked about color in Old Norse before, but if we look at different languages the world over, we see that even though human beings, for the most part, unless they're colorblind or blind, of course, perceive the same differences between colors, they categorize them differently. So let's take the example of blue. I'll show you just some little squares on the screen here. So this color, think about it, if you're a native English speaker, think about what the most basic single word you would use to describe that color is. I'm going to say blue. Now look at this square. What's the most basic single word you would use to describe that color? Probably blue. But they're different, right? One is light blue, one is dark blue, or you might be fancier and say sky blue and ocean blue or something like that. Now take a look at this square. What's the most basic word you could use to describe that? Green, I would presume. All right, well, we see, though, that all three of these colors are different. Now, different languages are going to categorize those differences differently. In English, we see that the two blues are different, but we don't categorize them as different categories. They're both parts of the wider category blue. We do categorize the green differently from the blue. In Russian, all three of those are different categories, right? The light blue and the dark blue aren't parts of one category. One is sinyi and one is goluboy. I'm sure I'm pronouncing those horribly. And then in Welsh, you have a situation where all three of those are parts of one category, glas. Not that a Welsh speaker doesn't perceive the differences. The Welsh speaker categorizes them differently. So that kind of taxonomic difference is really, I think, one of the major differences between thinking in different languages. Another one, of course, is grammatical gender. Anyone who studied Spanish knows that words are masculine or feminine without necessarily referring to the fact that they are literally male or literally female. And in Old Norse, of course, is masculine, feminine, and neuter, as there are in many other older Indo-European languages, or in Icelandic and Norwegian today. So that's different because you have to think, a book is feminine, right? Not that you have to consciously think about this if you're a native speaker or a competent speaker of the language, because it comes naturally, but it is something different from in English where we really don't have those categories for inanimate objects. Otherwise, Old Norse has some categories that English doesn't. One is a number category. In English, we have singular and plural, right? We have a book, books, rifle or rifles, barn, barns. But in Old Norse, there's also a residual dual category. In Gothic, the dual category is much more robust. But in Old Norse, it's been lost to a great extent, and it's only still there in a couple of pronouns. So, for instance, there is a singular I, there's a plural we, just like in English, but there's also a dual we. So, for just we too. So I say ek if it's just me talking, we if I'm talking about a larger group, and ver in Old Norse, and then vit if I'm just talking about me and one other person. Same thing with you. There's singular thu, plural but dual it, later thit, and ther. So that's a little bit different. And of course, Old Norse has case distinctions, so that nouns and adjectives and articles and pronouns appear in different forms, whether they're the subject of a sentence, the object of a sentence, the direct object versus the indirect object, or whether they're possessive or objects of prepositions. That's different from English, but it doesn't mean you can say different things in Old Norse than you can in English. It might mean that you need fewer or more words, but that doesn't mean that you can't say basically the same thing. I think about in the poem Thrymskvida, in the Poetic Edda, there's an instance where Thor and Loki are about to go to Jotunheim, both disguised as women. Thor has had to put on a wedding dress, but he still looks like Thor underneath that. Loki is a shape changer, and he's actually changed himself into a woman. And he says to Thor, Vit två are going to go to Jotunheim. Vit två, that's the dual form of we, vit, and then två is the neuter form of two. Old Norse has masculine, feminine, and neuter two. Now, if he were calling them both men, he would say tver, masculine two. If he was calling them both women, he'd say tvär, feminine two. He says två, meaning one of them is masculine, one of them is feminine. So it's a joke. Hard to say which one he's saying is a woman. Is he insulting Thor, or is he describing his own case? I think he's kind of ambiguously insulting Thor. But you can't do that in English without using a lot more words, right? We too, man and woman, is about as close as you can get in English, and it lacks the punch a little bit because it's, you have to use more words to do it. It's less subtle. So in that way, those categories can allow a little bit more wordplay in one or another language. And speaking of wordplay, Skaldic poetry in Old Norse is an interesting case of this, because you wonder if the Skaldic poets are coming up with all these crazy kennings for things, right? I mean, the sword is the eel of battle. Why is the sword an eel? Well, of course, it shares the fact that it's long, slippery, and shiny with an eel. And, you have to have a pretty rich mental life to think about how a sword and an eel parallel each other. And I think maybe that kind of poetic styling can actually influence how someone thinks about a language. But that's a matter of the most advanced, most creative users of a language. In English, we could do Skaldic poetry. I could call swords, eels of battle. No one would understand me. So, of course, that requires a lot of conventions in the language community. It's not necessarily a function of the language itself being different in some way. So, as a translator working from Old Norse into English, or increasingly as people request me to work from English into Old Norse, I do have to think about these questions a little bit, but, it's just, I think if anything, the hardest thing to translate is going from English to Old Norse, in as much as English uses lots of abstracts that Old Norse doesn't, right? Old Norse is a pretty concrete language for the most part. We're talking about real world situations, whereas in English we often want to talk about things in terms of abstractions. Like in English we have all these words for things like, for instance, in the 9 noble virtues that people draw out of Havamal, one of them is discipline or self-discipline. It's difficult to come up with a word in Old Norse that really means that, because you can maybe say it as a verb in Old Norse, control yourself, hold yourself, something like that. But a noun for that concept is difficult to come up with, and difficult, and even if you can come up with something, it's hard to find something that's actually paralleled in a real Old Norse text somewhere. But that's still more like culture than linguistic categories, because, modern Icelandic is not very much changed from Old Norse, and yet they've come up with words for all these things. So, ultimately, thinking in one language or another is more a matter of recategorizing the world than of perceiving it differently, at least in the perspective of this particular Old Norse linguist. For now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm wishing you all the best.